Welcome to EPG Pathshala. This module is on addressing conflicts and peace building processes, which is part of the paper on fields of practice in social work, within which social work in conflict context has been discussed. So this is the third module within that section. My name is Shah Jahan. I am professor with School of Social Work, Tata Institute of Social Sciences. This module, we are looking at, after having an understanding of conflicts, the concepts and various processes related to analyzing conflicts. This module will be specifically looking at what are the ways in which conflicts are addressed, what are the conceptual as well as practice methods in addressing conflicts. And in the second section, we will also be looking at peace as a concept and peace building as a process. So let us start with the idea of what do we understand by conflict or addressing conflicts. We'll start with the processes related to addressing conflicts. Now, first of all, we need to understand that we have discussed this in the earlier modules, that conflicts is not always bad. Conflict can have positive outcomes as well. So it is neither good nor bad, but it is an inevitable situation in any society. So having understood conflict as an inevitable process, inevitable element of human society, we need to look at addressing conflict from that perspective, where elimination of conflict is not the objective. So, but at the same time, we also understand that all unresolved conflict decreases the productivity and lower the performance of people and societies. So, we need to understand conflict as something which is creating a trouble, but at the same time, not eliminating conflict is going to be the possibility or even the objective. So, although all conflicts are not necessarily unhealthy, but the energy ought to be channeled, energy engaged, involved in conflict need to be channeled positively. And that's what addressing conflict is all about. So, conflict has both positive and negative aspects, which arise both during as a result of interactions between conflicting individuals or groups. So, we will look at from conflict from a perspective of conflict contributing to social change. In an interesting book by Dean Pruitt and Jeffrey Rubin, the book titled Social Conflict, Escalation, Stalemate and Settlement, the authors identify 5 positive aspects related to conflict. The different aspects related to conflict are emanating from the fact that conflict can be used as a tool for social change, or conflict are part of a process of social change. So ensuring both interpersonal and intergroup dynamics involved in conflict will be the key for addressing conflicts. So conflict serves, on one side, it serves to discourage premature group decision making. I'll explain with an example where two conflicting individuals or probably two conflicting ethnic groups are involved in violence and arson and all. But if you are not able to, anybody who is engaged in conflict, addressing conflict kind of situations, if they try not to understand the various factors related to the conflict, one might probably, if it is not going to a serious violent kind of a conflict, one might not engage with the parties, and we might engage in a premature decision making in engaging it. Say, for example, in not bringing developmental interventions in those areas and things like that, which could be one of the primary reason for ensuing conflict between different ethnic groups. So it can serve as a tool for discouraging premature group decision making. Second could be a reconciliation of the parties. So social change can be brought together in a conflict situation by reconciliation between the parties. So you need to bring parties together to reconcile the conflict. And thirdly, it also strengthens intra-group unity. The conflict strengthens intra-group unity. When you are not understanding conflict as a process of social change, you might try to probably resolve or settle the conflict without probability of bringing the people who are involved in conflict together on various platforms where communication can be enhanced, the trust can be built. So existence of conflict can lead to a situation where strengthening of intra-group unity can be brought together, as well as inter-group communication can be brought. Now, from this perspective of social conflict having the possibility of social change, I'll take this, the framework which has been used by Francis. I've modified a little bit to understand different facets of conflict. If you start with the conflict as a situation of unbalanced power, essentially conflict is a situation of unbalanced power. That's why the conflict is existing. There are different parties having different power relations and things like that, and also an effort to control groups or control society. That's how the conflict are happening. So from the unbalanced power situation where oppression, injustice are the factors of the latent conflict, some societies, you take the example of caste conflict, caste oppression and injustice meted out to lower caste or Dalits could be a situation of conflict which lead to a kind of a latent conflict in a society. So this kind of an oppression over a long period of time can lead to creation of awareness and conscientization among the people who are involved or who are being oppressed. So this awareness, heightened awareness over a period of time will lead to a mobilization and empowerment of these communities. So once the oppression happens, it leads to awareness among the people that we are being oppressed, we are being subjugated, injustice is meted out to us. So that conscientization awareness lead to mobilization. This mobilization could actually lead to confrontation and overt conflict. And if you come down that diagram, you could see that this mobilization and empowerment can lead to confrontation and overt conflict. So this is where the conflict is happening. Now, there could be a situation that these confrontation and overt conflict can be negotiated, mediated, or some changes can be brought together by involvement of various parties. That could lead to some negotiation, some mediation, which will change probably the attitudes of different groups involved in conflict, and it could also lead to change in relationship. So there will be a kind of a temporary peace which will be existing in this kind of a situation. But at the same time, a single incident of violation of rights, justice or oppression can again take it back to heightened awareness of people. You could see that arrow towards going towards awareness and conscientization. So this kind of a situation where it continues to be in a circle could lead to something called a protracted conflict. Conflict reproduces conflict, and there could be situations of heightened escalation and then coming down, but at the same time small incidences could again further lead to conflict kind of a situation. So this is called a protracted conflict. And if you look at the diagram again, if you move from oppression to awareness and conscientization to the mobilization and empowerment, if it goes to a situation where a continuous confrontation and overt conflict happens which involve heightened violence, use of arms and physical violence, killing and all, this leads to a situation where you cannot come back from situation of violence and conflict. So that is known as intractable conflict. So that's another facet of the conflict which continues to be kind of a quite escalated situation of conflict which happens. So that process from oppression to awareness to mobilization and then moving to continued confrontation and overt conflict is known as intractable conflict. Now, a third channel in which this could happen is from the third point of mobilization and empowerment. There could be efforts to build peace, and peaceful coexistence can be actually brought together. So this process is actually where we are trying to look at conflict as a change agent or a social change process. So in which the mobilization and empowerment could be even actually used for productive activities like ensuring civic amenities, ensuring basic needs and things like that. So those kind of processes are essentially addressing the basic root causes of conflict sometimes. So this leads to a peaceful coexistence, and that peaceful coexistence coming down along the arrow, you could see an agreed relationship is developed, which is diametrically opposite to what we have talked about as unbalanced power. There exists a kind of a balanced power. So this is the whole way in which one could understand the conflict dynamics and how one could engage with conflict or address conflict through making it possible for communities to exist in a peaceful coexistence kind of a scenario. Now, having understood this various facets of protracted conflict, intractable conflict and constructive conflict, two questions comes to our mind. One is, can we put an end to a conflict? Is there a need for ending a conflict? These are the two critical concerns which we need to be addressing. Can we put an end to a conflict? Or is there a need to end the conflict? I would say that there is no need to put an end to the conflict. Conflict can continue to be there. At the same time, how do we channelize the conflict is going to be the key for addressing conflict. And so there is no need for looking at ending the conflict. So the way we are looking at is how do we address various factors which contribute to the conflict and which continue to reproduce conflict. And what are the activities and processes one can engage in addressing conflict. That will define the way we move forwards in addressing the conflict. So there are, in this process, there are multiple tracks in conflict resolution literature. You will find different tracks of conflict, addressing conflict. What are those different tracks? If there are two conflicting parties, there is a need for engaging with these two parties in the conflict. So track one conflict resolution process involves dialogue and settlement between the parties or actors involved in. So for example, if there are two ethnic groups, the Nagas and Kukis are fighting. So the leaders of Nagas and Kukis will be brought together to discuss about what are their concerns and how one can address those concerns. This is called track one negotiation. Track one process of conflict resolution. Then there are track two negotiation, track two processes which involves unofficial modes, which involves not necessarily the conflicting parties. Quite often you are not able to bring the conflicting parties on the table to discuss. The reason is that there is heightened violence and there is huge mistrust which exists between the conflicting parties. So in this track two processes, there could be unofficial modes, there could be cultural integration, there could be cultural engagement, there could be trade relations, there could be commerce and trade could be used, or various processes related to games, or sports events and things like that. So these are all track two processes where unofficial modes of engaging with conflicts are being used. There are situations where quite a lot of situations in conflicts, academicians are being brought to negotiate, or various peace emissaries are being brought into the picture. Various cultural programs are being organized to celebrate diversity and things like that. So these are processes which are involved in track two situation. And then track three is actually quite often we miss this process in many of the conflict resolution processes. Track three process involves the actual people who are engaged in the conflict. It is not two ethnic communities leaders who are actually suffered by the conflict. There are actually people on the ground needs to be talked to. They need to be engaged with the various multiple engagement with the civil society groups, community groups, and various small groups and individuals needs to be brought into the picture. This is called track three. So in conflict engagement process, there could be, you cannot have a single track alone deciding the conflict engagement process. There could be track one, track two, track three. So there could be multiple engagement, multi-track process, multi-pronged approach is necessary for conflict, addressing conflicts. Now, if you look at different approaches in literature, there you could see various processes. One is a conflict management. Second is termed as conflict settlement, and the third is conflict resolution, and the finally, very interesting and important process is called conflict transformation. So these are the 4 different approaches which are used in widely in conflict literature. So conflict management, you consider conflict as a consequence of difference of values and interests. Now, when there exists an ineradicable consequence of differences, you need to control, and this leads to violence and other kind of forms of violent expressions of conflict. You need to control that, you need to regulate that, you need to mitigate the impact of conflict through different ways. So the idea is that conflict needs to be managed. There are negative manifestations of conflict. You need to manage that situation. You need to contain the violence and outward expression of conflict. This is called conflict management. So quite often in various approaches by the government in addressing conflict will be using military strategies, bringing troops to control violence which is happening on the streets, and separating conflict parties, or maybe taking leaders of the conflicting groups into custody and keeping them at home arrest, and all those kind of things are situations where conflict are being managed. Or there are different tools which are used, say for example line of control. Why do we talk about line of control? Because there is a line which cannot be violated by both the parties. So you create a kind of a notional control line beyond which parties in conflicts cannot agree. Quite often this is happening in border disputes and things like that. Another example is ceasefire. No party should involved in firing or killing or engaging in violence. So ceasefire, if agreed upon by 2 parties, there is no resolution happen, but at the same time there is a way managing the conflict to from escalating it into violence is to have a ceasefire situation. But looking at this conflict management, which is considered as a short-term kind of a solution, there is no durable elimination of the causes of conflict. You are just trying to avoid a situation of overt conflict. The second process could be a conflict settlement. Conflict settlement is a process where we are actually looking at bringing parties on the table to reach an agreement. This is what we are trying to agree, and this we will be willing to forego. So there are ways in which agreements are being made between the conflicting parties. So it involves negotiation, bargaining, some of the demands which one party has been putting up needs to be compromised, or some concessions needs to be given for different parties involving in conflict. So this process is actually arriving at an agreement that you are not going to involve in violence and arson and various kind of killing and all. You are agreeing on certain terms. So these agreements are quite often brought together by third parties, mediators involved in the conflict. The interesting part of this conflict settlement is that neither of the party might achieve what they have actually aspired for. So they will be lowering their demands, or they will be compromising certain aspects of their demands and things like that. Sometimes pressures of sanctions and control of supply and all those kind of things could be there. Sometimes there could be some inducements like positive inducements or incentives for not engaging in conflict. So these are ways in which conflicts are being settled. These are put down in the form of certain kind of agreements or accord, peace accord and all those kind of stuff. Here again, if you look at conflict settlement, the underlying relationships and structures of structures which create conflict are remaining unaddressed. You cannot have a situation where conflict settlement is addressing the basic relational issues, the structures which reproduce violence and things like that. So there are aspects. So if you look at after the World War I, the Versailles Treaty was brought into control or end World War, but it didn't end there. It again escalated to World War II and going to Cold War, and then came probably a kind of a peaceful existence. So conflict settlement is one process. Now, the third approach is conflict resolution. The conflict resolution is actually the conflict resolution is trying to question and reframe the positions. If you remember the structure which I was talking about in the previous module about the positions being the outward expression of the conflict, and then comes down, you will find interest and needs coming down. So the positions of the conflicting parties need to be reframed. We need to have a kind of a comprehensive approach to understand the deep-rooted sources of conflict. You come down from the positions and then interests and values, and then comes to the needs. You come down what kind of basic issues, root causes are creating problems, and then try to resolve by analyzing conflicts, what we have discussed in the previous module about analyzing the conflict and conflict dynamics and all. You find solutions which can appropriately use as methods for institutionalization of peace. I could take the example of Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa. So that has been institutionalization of peace, which is evolved through a proper analysis of marginalities of different sections and the structures which creates, and the governmental institutional mechanisms which lacked in restoring peace and avoiding violence. So those things are being worked out, and conflict resolution has been worked out through Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa. So this, again, there are problems that this resolved, but at the same time it could again further lead to complications at a later stage. Resolution is not a permanent solution as well, because we are not essentially dealing with the relational aspects in conflict here at the same time. So going to the fourth approach of conflict, addressing conflict, is a conflict transformation. This is an inherently engaging, inherently deep-rooted or long drawn process where the energies spent in conflict are being channelized into positive outcomes. So it's not only the need for shifting positions is needed, but also transforming relationship between the conflicting parties are very, very important. It is a highly process oriented, long term, deeper structural approach which is not aiming at permanent closure of the conflict, but channelization of energies involved in conflict and using it for transforming the relationships. I could give the example of working in a communal conflict kind of a situation where youth groups engaged in a long drawn exercise where they have engaged with various community groups. Youth group belong to different religious communities coming together, using sports and other cultural activities as a means. So it is transforming. It's not only changing the situation of violence and conflict, but at the same time engaging with various parties involved in the conflict, whereas the relationship between the conflicting groups are reframed and reinvented so that further conflict, further violence can be avoided. So this approach of conflict transformation involves multi-tracks needs to be used, multi-pronged approach using culture, using various other kinds of developmental interventions, and all those things are required to be used in this process. So conflict transformation essentially changes the relationship, and that's what is not probably happening in all other processes of approaches of conflict. Now, having discussed various approaches in conflict from a social work perspective, we need to understand what do we mean by peace. The second section which I was explaining in this module is addressing and understanding peace. So peace is something, how do we understand peace? Peace is a process, as a concept, where if you look at the most popular meaning of peace is the absence of some kind of antagonistic conflict or war. But that doesn't say everything about conflict. It could be a sense of peace primarily in this situation of existence of antagonistic conflict or war. You could see the freedom, there is a need for a freedom from or a cessation of war, hostilities. There could be a hostility, there could be a war, there could be violence happening. We need to have a situation of avoiding and complete stoppage of these hostilities. Second is freedom from civil commotion or disorder. Any violence happening on the road, between parties, that has to be avoided. Disturbance and perturbation. Quite often what happens is in conflict situations, schools are not able to work because there are overt violence happening, stone throwing, all those kind of situations happening. So there is disturbance in the normal lives. Supply is hit. So they need to have a freedom from this disturbance and perturbation. And fourthly, freedom from quarrels, dissension between individuals. Sometimes because of the existing animosities, some individuals getting into small altercation can lead to violence. So these kind of micro expression of conflict also need to be avoided. So peace should have all these avoidance of antagonistic conflict or violence kind of a situation. Now, Johann Galtung, in his seminal work on structural violence, he talks about peace is absence of violence, obviously, but at the same time, how do we define violence? What is violence? Is it violence means killing, or is it maiming or injury? It is not necessarily always physical violence. He talks about or differentiates between direct violence and structural violence in his thesis. So there is, when somebody living in a community context is not able to actually achieve the potential which he or she may have, so that is violence. Say for example, if I am not able to, a child living in a slum is not able to get proper education because of structural issues of not having education facilities there, is violence. If children dying of malnutrition is because of inability to provide food and ensuring food safety and security, that is violence. So these are it doesn't involve direct physical violence, but there are structures of inequality, structures of oppression, structures of institutional structures which create unequal power relations. So these unequal power relations reduce the chances of people to achieve their potentials or realization of their potential. So absence of direct violence could be one part, but having social justice and equality is also necessary for ensuring that there is peace. So the absence of violence is termed as negative peace, whereas having social justice and equality is considered as positive peace. So now going further from Johann Galtung's idea of structural violence, I take the theoretical ideas of development as freedom by Amartya Sen. So Amartya Sen talks about freedom as something which is defining achievement of development and thereby justice, and thereby extending it to the peace. So freedom as process that allow free actions and decisions and opportunities available for people. With these opportunities, lack of these opportunities, what Johann Galtung was talking about as violence, structural violence. So removal of unfreedom is development for Zen. So this removal of unfreedom from not having developmental opportunities and all those kind of unfreedoms which Zen is talking about can lead to achieving people's potential. So that is peace. So I am trying to extend Amartya Sen's idea of freedom to how to achieve peace. So peace is a goal and process of expanding people's freedom or removal of structural violence. So we can see the comparability of these two approaches by Johann Galtung in structural violence as well as peace as freedom or development as freedom by Zen, talking about similarity of these ideas. So essentially people should be able to achieve their potentials, removing of unfreedoms, and thereby people living in peace. So structural roots of conflicts are something which creates continuation of situation of continuation of conflicts. Now, for Amartya Sen, what are the freedoms which he is talking about? There could be economic opportunities. If economic opportunities are missing for people to ensure their livelihoods, that is creating, that's an unfreedom. If political freedoms, people are not able to engage in free and fair, election and other kind of political processes or their expression of dissent, there is lack of freedom. Social opportunities, if you're not able to interact with people, if you are, if your dignity is not maintained, those social opportunities are also, absence of those social opportunities are also unfreedoms. If transparency, if the money spent on development, people do not have the knowledge of how this money is being spent, it is also an unfreedom. So we talk about all these rights-based legislations in this kind of a context where the effort is to remove unfreedoms. And protective security. People do not have security if their children are, their rights are violated, or women are subjected to rape. So these are security situations which are creating a lack of security situations which create unfreedoms for people. For coming down to Galtung again, these freedom from direct violence is one, but equity guarantee is something which he is talking about as essentially part of the structural engagement or structural analysis of violence. So it comes down to the aspects of social justice and equity. Now, this could be considered as something which is the peace and development are essentially linked. When we are analyzing these two theoretical positions, we are not disengaging peace or disengaging peace from development. Development opportunities, lack of development opportunities is also a situation of lack of peace. So these two things are brought together, where the positive peace, idea of positive peace, of as justice, equality, and all those aspects will create situation of conflict. Now, so what we are trying to look at is peace building as a process where we are looking at, engaging with communities where successful peace building activities will create an environment of self-sustaining, durable peace, all those kind of issues. And at the same time, engage in developmental interventions which ensure that people's, situations of vulnerabilities are reduced. So from this process, I'll take to different dimensions so that we can come down to how do we engage with peace building in the context of addressing conflicts. So in one of the writings, Barnett divides peace building into 3 dimensions. There are 3 dimensions. One is the stabilizing in a post-conflict, stabilizing the post-conflict zone. The first dimension reinforce state of stability. You need to, because conflict is a situation where complete instability exists. The conflict, this dimension reinforces state of stability in a post-conflict and discourage former combatants from returning to violence and war. So quite often in this process, it talks about disarmament, demobilization and reintegration, DDR, that's what is being called. So we talked about mobilization of people because of awareness and things like that, mobilize and then getting into violence. So we are talking about disarmament. One, disarmament and reduction of physical violence needs to be there. Demobilization of people getting mobilized around those identity groups, which further creates situation of violence, and reintegration of this into the society is called one of the first approach or dimension. The second is restoring state institutions. Quite often in conflict situations, the state institutions fails or unable to deal with the conflict situation. So we need to ensure that the state institutions which not only deal with violence, but at the same time ensuring developmental opportunities. So we need to have a situation where these state institutions are effectively working. And finally, dealing with the social and economic issues. The social issues are there. It's not just a situation of law and order. There are social issues, there are economic issues. Programs need to be devolved for ensuring that these conflicts are addressed effectively to ensure that the development and opportunities for people are ensured. So in approaching conflict, one could look at avoidance, but that's not going to be giving much of results. But you also need to look at how do states respond. There is something called direct command resolution style, where if there is a violence, this is a standard operating procedure. So you need to have those kind of processes. The non-governmental as well as civil society engagement is also extremely important. Multi-track negotiations and mediations where different parties, academicians, cultural groups and various other kind of groups needs this thing. These needs to be brought together in a synergistic style. Sometimes religion is also being used, or faith is also being used as a way to engage with conflict. Sometimes religion itself can lead to conflict. So essentially, peace building process need to engage at 3 different levels. One is a top leadership level, at the national level, at the state level, whatever is the level of conflict happening. You need to have a top leadership engaging with it. You cannot have a situation where this is left to civil society or the people to deal with. There could be military interventions, there could be political engagement, there could be dialogues, all those kind of, that's a top leadership style, leadership engagement. Second could be the middle range, where groups, social groups, they have leadership. So we need to engage with them through workshops and various ethnic reintegration processes and all. And finally, level 3, which is grassroots leadership. Community members, ethnic groups and small groups, small youth groups, they need to be brought on together to deal with the conflict in a much more meaningful fashion, which is going to be in a way durable. So the affected population's engagement is extremely useful in this. Now, having discussed this from a social work perspective, what we are trying to talk about in conflict, dealing with conflict, is that we need to deal with the conflict from a social, economic and political perspectives. So in order to sum up this discussion, what we have dealt with in this module is that the need for addressing conflict and its positive aspects needs to be emphasized. There is a need to address, there are positive aspects of conflict, we need to deal with it. We need to analyze the dynamics of conflict and different approaches which are available, which we discussed briefly. And finally, the concept of peace and peace building has to be looked at from a much more ground level situation, where the peace is not something which can be brought through force, brought through militaristic or other kind of state interventions alone, but peace as an experience, a sense of justice, sense of peace is to be brought together. So these are different approaches in dealing with conflict. Essentially, social work perspective put focus on engaging with communities and people. There are readings which are given in the module, and these readings will be able to help you to get further understanding and insights into this. Thank you so much.